and we welcome Ken to the Into Property Investing podcast today. We're thrilled to be joined by Kenneth Okafor. Is that correct,
Okafor.
Ken?
Okafor.
Okafor, thank you.
Yeah.
A talented and visionary architectural designer and founder of Studio Kazad, established in 2017. Studio Kazad specialized in architecture and design and help property owners to enhance and transform their spaces through expert guidance and meticulous approach to every stage of the design and construction and planning process. So, huge welcome to Ken. Ken brings a wealth of experience having worked across a diverse number of projects, ranging from residential to commercial to retail and mixed-use developments, and also community-focused designs. So Ken has a deep understanding of planning policies, regulations, sustainable principles, and him and his team provide services like feasibility studies, planning applications, 3D concepts, and compliance documentation. Literally everything a property investor or development might need to bring their visions to life. So beyond that technical expertise, Kenneth has a passion. He's passionate about architects and to inspire and transform communities, and practically has earned a reputation as a designer who not only meets deadlines but exceeds expectations. In today's episode, we'll dive into Kenneth's journey, explore the role of architects in property development, and uncover insights to help investors make the most out of the project. So let's get started. So Ken, a huge welcome to the Into Property Investing podcast.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you for bringing me on this podcast.
So this morning, like I said, we're here to discuss a whole range of topics which are relevant to property investors and developers. So without further ado, we'll just make a little bit of a start. That's okay. Great. So could you give me a brief background? What's the difference between an architect and architectural designer?
The difference between an architect and architectural designer is based upon, in the UK's use of the title architect. They do similar roles in terms of designing spaces and in buildings. The main difference is that the role of an architect is protected under the title, the architect, with the architect's the ARB, so it's the Architects Register Board. So you have to be a member, you have to complete certain qualifications. I've only completed 2 qualifications. I'm in the process of becoming a member of the ARB, but with other commitments. So there are similar roles. You could say the difference between the two, you could easily say the fact that an architectural designer is more specialized in certain fields in terms of construction and detailing. Architectural designers, not only you have graduate architects that haven't got that full qualification of an architect, but you've got architecture technologists, architect technicians, builder designers, anyone who has that skills and knowledge and experience in terms of dealing with building design queries through planning, builder regulations, principal designer role, project management aspect. So there's just one to distinguish the two, because in today's society, I think people call themselves architects, they call themselves, not going through the process itself. It is long-winded, and there are some architects that have been there for years, but they don't want to call themselves architects because you have to pay an extra fee, caught out by someone for using the title. So just to clarify that with the audience, because regardless of the differences, you could say from my clients, they would say the fact that an architect designer is more affordable than an architect based upon, affordability, based upon delivery expectations, making sure they know the knowledge. There are some architects that can do similar things, but I think it's just the majority of architecture designers that tend to be more efficient in terms of dealing with construction issues or dealing with any particular issues from the planning processes to building regulation compliance.
It sounds like quite a process, really.
Yes, it is. With 7 years of studying, it's is something, but I feel like it's the way in terms of where we are at the moment with this high demand for properties to be completed and giving certain consultation with certain clients. It is all about time and delivery and quality in the process. So it is long-winded. I feel we do have an issue where, especially with foreign architects coming from abroad, but they have to register with the ARB in order to go through the process, which is quite long-winded. I think we're talking about $2,000 to do an exam. So it's like a lot of money to do something like that. There are some issues. We have an educational issue in terms of being taught. We're not being taught about business, we're not being taught about technical issues. So there's a lot of things that needs to be addressed from the ARB in relation with the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. I think those two organisations got a bit of problems back and forth about what an architect can do or can't do within public and private sectors of construction. But I think that's something up in the air that needs to be addressed at the moment.
I'm sure there's many situations in the property industry which need to be addressed. It's probably just on that long list
to
work through for the government. So can you give me a brief intro to your company, how you got started, how many years of experience, and your specialist areas which you like to get involved with them?
Yeah, my journey into architecture is quite intriguing. I was brought up in a housing estate in Hackney, London. I was born and raised in Hackney. I was born with a learning difficulty with dyslexia, and I was brought up more visually in terms of drawing and making things. I got more into it as I grew older. I got into the sciences and the maths and more into that field of creativity. And I really wanted to do something in terms of construction when I was at art college. I did my foundation in spatial design studies, and then I did a specialized course into architecture. I think that's where I met a tutor, a course leader who's very, very good in terms of teaching into architecture. It's all about keeping the existing structure of the building, but you can actually redesign internally from a technical point of view as well as a design point of view. And not only that, I think my first glimpse of property investment is when he's an Arsenal supporter. I think this is when Arsenal moved into the new football stadium, and the old Highbury Stadium is being converted into residential properties. That's where I first picked it up. Despite the fact that I'm a Tottenham fan, I don't really care. But that's where I've got the first idea of property development in terms of having an old building that could be used for residential purposes and making a profit out of it. And that's where he was the one that introduced me to the idea of property investment in this industry, which gives you an idea about what you can and can't do with a building. There's a huge value to what you can at the end of the
Yeah, and certainly I'm sure that you had some input on the away change rooms to make sure they were brilliant.
Yes.
So yeah, obviously that's really interesting. It's maybe not the traditional way of coming into all the industries, but it's great to hear that the barriers have been broken down. There are opportunities for everyone and different ways to enter into the property investment and property sector as a whole. Can you tell us about your journey into architecture and what inspired you to specialise in property development projects?
When I completed, because I studied spatial design at St Martin's in London, a foundation course for 1 year, and then I got into architecture at the University of Brighton for 3 years, and then I've worked with a few builders when I first graduated, and there were, regardless of the fact that there was not much architecture work, there was some property development work in the process, and I've seen how I've worked with a few builders in London, how they design their ideas. They don't want to submit stuff to planning. So it's all about technical information regarding building control compliance. So I had that idea of it, and then I went on to do, with the art, because I studied with the RBA route. I studied at Strathclyde University in Glasgow because I specialised in sustainability and Islamic architecture in terms of, this way of pragmatic architectural design work in Glasgow. So with the way the architecture in Glasgow is based upon, it's got this strong character in terms of its external facade and its way of using materials, and it's quite, in terms of narrow-minded way of providing simple architecture. So I've learnt that for 1 year, and then I went back to London to do a part 2 at the University of East London, which actually, again, that involves a bit of residential design as well as designing mixed use. My dissertation or my final major project was specialised in social housing in Hackney, looking in terms of how residents can actually contribute public spaces in terms of building some kind of idea of social cohesion and affordable housing. So it's like that process itself, it's all about knowing about housing, but also property investment. When I was studying at university, I was working with a lighting designer in London, and I was working with property investors. There was a project I've worked in a hotel in near Tower Bridge that involved about a property investor buying an old property, and we had the idea of contributing to the lighting design as well as the interior design aspect. So in that framework, in that time frame within the last 3 to 4 years, it's all a few clients that made some property investment queries in the process. So I feel like it's just, instead of, looking at the cost of demolition, it's all about maintaining its building itself and looking at ways to, not only invest in the property, looking at the return on investment as well in terms of what you can, in terms of selling it back onto the market. So all of that is like picking up key phrases, key experiences, and I've always maintain that interest in property investment for clients because it's another way to make a profit or make a way to sustain yourself in terms of making sure that you're not going to get into that risk of, exceeding your expectations with an existing building. There's a book out, and one of my former tutors wrote a book about a building has its own voices and looking at how you can actually keep its character but also, change the profile in terms of, from office to residential or commercial to residential. So different forms of buildings have their own character that you can actually change the process. And I feel like property investors like that sort of thing because it's all about making sure that you can fulfill its potential and making sure that you actually complement its existing framework. So that's what I've come across, what I've studied for the last couple of years in terms of what property investors like to see.
Yeah, it's certainly repurposing buildings, isn't it? Essentially, especially if you're using the buy, refurbish, refinance model.
Yeah.
I mean, it's repurposing those buildings and making sure that they work both in terms of living spaces and also as an investment for those property investors.
Yeah.
So what would you say are the most common projects you've worked on and how do they relate back to property investors?
So where I'm at with my business at the moment, I've been working with a few property investors in London and outside of London. Most of it was predominantly residential. You have a few commercial properties, but mostly residential. I think for what I've gathered with the last 5 years now, they look at the way they use their finances to develop and find a way to sell or rent these properties. They want to make sure they optimize the amount of area size to create some kind of profitability. So they want to make a profit out of it. So they want to make sure that they look at a particular, so with my feasibility studies, you look at a particular building to see what you can and can't do within a building. What they normally do is they want to make sure there's actually potential. They don't want any disruptions in the process. So I feel like it's all about being more conscious, being more aware about what you're buying and what you can actually achieve. There are moments when a property developer will buy a property, they'll be like, okay, I've got this property. And then you just look at the planning stages, you can't do anything about it. You receive a lot of refusals. Most of it is residential, but it's all about looking at feasibility studies of what you can and can't do, whether you could do a flat conversion, you could do a HMO, can you achieve all of those new build as well, all of those things. It's all about looking at its potential. At the end of the day, property investors want to see how much money they can afford, whether you need to bring in a cost consultant or a quantity surveyor to see whether they can actually fit to their bill.
Yeah, it is all in that planning process, and obviously the architectural technician forms a key part of that.
Yeah.
So tell our audience why. Obviously, some investors won't use architects or won't use architectural technicians, but potentially they're missing a trick. So why should property investors hire an architect technician or an architect for all their projects?
I think that's a very good question. I feel like architects can actually specialize in optimizing spaces because they can ensure the layouts and design make the best use of available square per meter in terms of its layout. It can actually have, because the thing is, in relation to looking at the ways of making a profit, they can find a way to increase rental sale value at the end of the day. Also as well, architects, it depends what type of architect you're working with astounding plan application knowledge of dealing with building regulations compliance. They can navigate the complexities of local regulations, like to prevent cost delays or fines or whatever that is required. And also as well, I feel like architects can actually contribute some kind of construction knowledge in terms of what you can expect to reduce the risk of unexpected costs during construction, because it's by designing the buildability and maintenance in mind, because architects can minimize future operational expenses and ensure durability. So, from what I work with property developers is to make sure that when it comes to construction stages, we want to make sure what can be achieved within that constrained budget and time frame, depending on we bring in a contractor that can understand the language of making sure that we can actually achieve these goals and expectations. So architects are quite good in terms of site-specific challenges. Or dealing with awkward plots, or if there's issues with heritage, complex urban context when it comes to parking, or when it comes to biodiversity net gain. There's a creative way to overcome those expectations, and I always encourage property developers to use architects or architectural designers or architect technicians that has that. It's all about having that knowledge at the end of the day.
Yeah, it is about having someone as part of your power team who can help you overcome those challenges and maximise ultimately your profit as an investor. But it's also about the durability, which you touched on in your answer. It's about the durability of products. So what you don't want to do is go around and make lots of repairs when you've got tenants in situ. That becomes an even bigger headache.
Yeah.
And potentially costly. So if you can avoid those costly mistakes and front it up, essentially, then that's a benefit to many of the investors. What would you say are some of the misconceptions property investors might have about working with an architect?
I think it's costs. I think I picked up a lot of projects from previous architects that worked with property developers, and it's all about cost. Because the thing is, they looked at the fees, they can have a discussion, oh, it's too expensive, why am I paying it? There's an issue with architects being paid low, and does it seem like a glamorous role? Also, as well, from what I gathered, is when it comes to it does take time to develop a design or delaying the overall project timeline. The way architects work, they do work very, very, delicate in terms of producing design ideas. I think it just depends on the complexity of the project. So they will look at it that some property investors that I've been told by a few property developers or property investors, they will say like, oh, some of them take some long to take work to be completed. Why the design disappearance? It seems like when it comes to time expectations to complete a work with an architect, it does bring a bit of frustration but I think the main issue is cost, because I've managed to pick up a few projects from other architects that worked with property investors to get work completed as soon as possible, as well as having affordability. Then again, if I can explain it later on in the podcast about how the fees are being calculated, I think it does depend on the complexity of the project as well as the timeline itself. So yeah, that's the main issue when it comes to the fees itself, because that's an issue where they don't want to spend X amount of money on an architectural fees that work's not being completed on time, or don't know what they're doing in the process.
Yeah, and I think it comes back down to the planning from the investor. So, if you know that you're purchasing a property which will need work, to try and engage an architect as soon as possible, even if you haven't completed on that deal. Yes, not every deal completes clearly, but actually engaging with someone, making sure that you've got them on board so they're aware of what timescales you're probably working to. With a really clear, open communication can really help that process.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I said, it is about having a proper plan of what you want to do with the property right away from the moment you're making that offer. So, yeah, obviously, architects can add value to small-scale property development projects, like conversion of a single house into HMOs or flats, or an unregulated loft conversion, etc. How do you feel you add your value in those kind of areas?
It's all about discovering potential development in terms of what you're doing inside a property. You can identify ways of increasing the property's value, like when it comes to adding an extra room or converting an underused area like a basement or a garage into habitable spaces, which is quite common nowadays. Of course, people, depending on, outdoor visual input, you can add a balcony or terraces just to make sure they have that outdoor accessibility. So you're looking at unlocking the development potential within a property, but also as well, you create flexible and adaptable spaces. You are configuring that can allow a future conversion back to a single family home if it's possible, but also looking at ways of designing spaces that can adapt to changing the market needs. So I feel like in terms of the marketing appeal, you could look at ways of I can actually design that can enhance the property's appeal to tenants and buyers. So if you look at it in terms of HMO or small flat conversions across the UK, it can actually build some more, value in terms of adding open plan living spaces or natural light with Velux windows, or you're looking at storage solutions to appeal to certain individuals that don't want to use one of those storage units outside the property. So you're looking at ways to unlock its potential within a house, and looking at aesthetically and looking in terms of its functional value, where we can actually create designs that not only look good but function well, because there are some properties they look at it's just the function itself in terms of access from the bedroom to the bathroom. So you're looking at ways to build up that internal alteration in terms of what that person can fulfill that space at the end of the day. So I have worked with property investors in terms of making spaces more holistic, trying to build more natural light, especially with natural light, and also build some kind of colour appeal in terms of lighting and in terms of the type of wallpaper or carpeting, or just to build up a mental health well-being for the tenants to fulfill those living spaces, to ensure that they can actually get a good value from it at the end of the day.
And can you explain, therefore, the key differences? One of the things we get quite a lot is people are asking, what's the difference between planning permission, building regs? Are you able to explain the difference for our listeners?
Yeah. So the difference between planning and building regs, planning is all about how the land and buildings are being used. So how the buildings are being constructed is more of a building regulations issue in terms of safety, in terms of structural stability. That's something clients do get muddled up when it comes to discussing the project. They thought it's like the whole stage, but there's different stages in terms of seeking planning approval and then seeking builder regulation approval. So with planning, it's all about how the building's being used on land. You're talking about, in terms of, if you're going to construct a new building, you're talking about the appearance and the impact of development on the environment. How does it fit to the landscape? How does it fit to the street scene in any particular area in the UK? You're looking in terms of how highway access is related to, in terms of parking, in terms of how cycle storage is being used, or you're looking in terms of, ways of making sure it doesn't cause any traffic among the public spaces. It's just what they like to see with planning is, making sure the proposed designs complies with their their national planning policy framework, which has recently been updated from last month. So it's all about complying with the way the local authorities expect you to design, whether it's a extension, loft conversion. Well, extension to loft conversion, looking at permitted development, but there's some extensions, proposals that exceed permitted development rules. Looking at new build, change of use, all of those things that comes with planning. Now, builder regulations, it talks about how buildings are constructed in terms of how buildings relate to fire precautions and escape through fire safety regulations. You're talking about energy conservation, sound insulation, looking at the facilities for people with disabilities on the part. And of course, with the process is required detailed construction drawings to ensure that not only the building control inspector look at it and look at if it's compliant, but also for the contractor to see how the construction works in the process when it gets to the construction stages. So the difference between the two is that planning is all about presenting ideas that the building can work within the site surroundings. Builder regulations is all about construction detailing and making sure it's structurally stable in terms of its compliance with the certain chapters in each of the approved document.
I've not heard it explained like that, but that's really clear, I think. Thank you, Ken. So obviously a lot of councils have brought in Article 4 in certain areas, which can be a bit of a challenge for investors.
Yeah.
So could you explain what Article 4 is and how an architect can help navigate some of those restrictions?
Yes, Article 4 is everyone gets confused with Article 4. Article 4 direction is like a legal tool that local authorities use to limit the types of changes that can be made to a property or area without planning permission. So it's like there's some properties within that area that can be used to protect the character of an area, such as a conservation area, from inappropriate development. So it's quite common that this rule is not really clearly explained to some homeowners or property investors. You could say it does have a connection with conservation area, or if that area itself has some kind of heritage. So that's something that people do get misconstrued. But, what an Article 4 is looked upon and how we deal with it is based upon researching into the local planning authorities. They have their own map, they have their own policies based on it, so they have their own boundary. If you look at any local authority in England, they have their own boundary which is based upon Article 4. And we have to do is, the next stage is we have to identify what types of development are restricted within Article 4, such as HMOs, change of use, external alterations. I think all of that information, what benefits to property investors is that this knowledge helps investors avoid non-compliant proposals and focus on viable strategies. So, for example, I've worked in a few Article 4 direction properties. You can't add a Velux window at the front of the property. So that's one rule that you can't actually deal with. Or you can't add, you could say something that is like contemporary design feature of a window or a door. So those rules are quite difficult to overcome Article 4. It does sound like it's within like some form of listed building conservation area, but it is dependent upon what you can achieve within those areas. I think there's a historical context into Article 4 in terms of how these properties were designed during the old days. But with the role of an architect or an architectural designer in terms of maximising development in terms of its potential, you could design layout for a HMO that meets planning policies and housing standards, or you could look at ways of aligning with the area's character by using, heritage-related materials, in terms of tiles or bricks or, timber windows. I think it just gives investors can still achieve some form of profitable development without breaching restrictions. And also as well, mitigating risk as well in the process, because when it comes to these things like Article 4, you can look at areas where planning permission is unlikely to be granted. So, for example, if you want to introduce aluminium windows in an Article 4 direction area, that's highly unacceptable. So all of those things that could actually make sure we don't lead the property investor to risk that could lead to an enforcement action, which is quite common where people don't have an idea of what you can and can't do within an Article 4 direction area. It's like dealing with, conservation and heritage issues, which people have no idea. If you meet any particular client that has a listed building, they have no clue what you can and can't do inside. So they remove a staircase that has a special feature, and then there'll be an enforcement action when the conservation officer visits. So it's all about making sure that when it comes to these issues, I will always make sure with my clients is that I want to provide sensitive designs that are more likely to gain planning approval and preserve the property's value. At the end of the day, you're treating it as if it's like there's value to the property in terms of its features, in terms of what you can achieve. There are properties that are listed buildings or that are within the conservation area, that are within Article 4, that people want to make into a HMO or flat conversion. Always encourage clients of mine to make sure they pay attention to it, because it does build some kind of difficulty with the conservation officer. In terms of the dialogue that you can and can't do, especially when you write heritage statements, and ensuring that it has no impact on the existing feature. So that's where the significance play in terms of the external and internal feature of a listed building that has some kind of historical context, but making sure that doesn't fulfill any issues with the local authority, because it does. People just have no clue about these rules and regulations.
Yeah, there's so many rules and regulations which are there, and it's really important to adhere to them. So you don't want to fall on the wrong side of the law when you're doing your property developments. What role does an architect play in ensuring HMOs meet certain standards for safety, space, and amenities, for example? And every local authority might be slightly different. So, yeah, what role would you play in make sure that you property investor meets those?
I've always ensured that there is HMO, within local authorities in England that have their own guidelines across England, what you can and can't do in a HMO property. Unlike people who non-architects or non-architectural designers, sometimes they do without reading the guidelines, which is quite common. And then when it comes to submitting the documents to a HMO planning officer, it will get refused. So I've always encouraged my clients to make sure there's a HMO guideline of what you can and can't do, because there are specific rules and regulations, because you have to meet design layouts that meet the minimum room sizes and communal space standards specified in HMO regulations. That's one thing that could be put into, and also as well, fire safety in terms of, designing a space that is fire resistant with fire resistant doors and partitions, whether it's 30 minutes or 60 minutes. You have to make sure you showcase knowledge of the use of plans for, fire detection systems, emergency lighting and escape routes. I think that rule, that needs to be heavily encouraged in terms of with the Building Safety Act, which we explain later on. Amenity standards as well. They want to make sure there's specific area sizes where there's adequate amenities to meet the needs of occupants and local authority requirements, as is always required for any particular HMO project. Plan sufficient bathrooms, toilets, wash basins, design kitchen spaces, depending on the number of occupants you have in a property. And also, of course, I've always encouraged the property investors or property developers or clients to make sure there's like a project oversight and quality insurance, just to make sure the construction phase, to ensure the work aligns with approved plans and regulatory standards. Because sometimes people don't fulfill that stage, just to make sure at the end there's no form of snagging picking up during the post-occupancy stages. So all of that, making sure everything's up to high quality standards to ensure that HMO has been fulfilled, and making sure you don't get some form of enforcement from the HMO officers, because sometimes people exceed the limit in terms of the number of occupants living in the property spaces.
Thank you, Ken. Ken, I'm just going to ask to stop for like 2-3 minutes.
Yeah.
And then I'll be back. Feel free to stay on the
Okay.
call. I think it's probably still record, but it'll be edited out. So
Okay.
just give me 2-3 minutes. I'm just going to pay the good gent to fit in the carpet upstairs.
Excellent. That's all right.
Never had to stop a recording for a carpet before, but there we go. It's the first for everything. Thank you. So obviously there's so much to consider in terms of standards for HMOs. It just makes sense to have a really good architect or architectural technician working alongside you to make sure that you're maximizing that space, adhering to all the regulations, because they'll help make sure that you don't trip yourself up, really. In terms of all those regulations. But talking about regulations, I'm sure there's more regs to come in terms of, especially with the government change. They're looking at the planning process quite a lot at the moment. Are there any up and coming changes to the regulations that property investors should be aware of?
I think everyone is well aware for the last year or two is the Building Safety Act, which is coming up right now, and I think there's more set to the rule because, of course, because it's the fact that it significantly impacts the construction and real estate sector in terms of all building types, including residential. Because what happened with Grenfell, I think they want to make sure the safety regulations are being adhered to, and it does cost a lot of money to ensure that you get specific materials for specific issue that everything that needs to be implemented within the Building Safety Act. You're looking at, well, at the end of the day, the Building Safety Act aims to safeguard people in buildings by focusing on critical areas like fire safety and making sure that the building regulation compliance documents are being approved, and looking at different specific materials that's being implemented within the building itself. It does have this impact on how property investors look in terms of their finances, because you have to purchase specific fire alarm systems or specific doors or specific, there's a project I was working in Bolton that unfortunately the person has to purchase specific insulation for fire stopping that is converted into a residential care home. So all of that is something that needs to be implemented in terms of the Building Safety Act. I think as well with the new government coming in, people who have second homes, they're thinking of doing HMO, I think there's going to be higher rates for second homes because from starting October this year, there'll be an additional 5% stamp duty land tax will apply to properties priced between, around 50k to 250k. I feel like this is like a change aims to address housing affordability by discouraging the purchase of additional properties, potentially impacting investors acquiring second homes to buy and let properties. We have this issue where first-time buyers are finding it the struggle to buy a new home. I think the government are trying to address that issue in terms of addressing the housing issue we have in the UK, and people don't want to live, people want to build a new family and want to build a new life for themselves. So they're trying to find a way to address that issue. I think as well, there's, in terms of HMO, in terms of its licensing process, and I feel that they're going to do some implementing additional HMO licensing schemes to improve housing standards. There are some local authorities in England that are actually quite concerned about the quality of how HMOs have been designed, and they're going to put into some kind of review to determine the need for a new destination commercial way of monitoring the way HMOs have been designed. There's some HMO properties I visited when I'm doing surveying, and some of the quality is very nice quality, high quality design. Some of it is low quality design. So they are going to try and emphasize on HMO landlords to make sure the quality of design in bedrooms or in living spaces that is fulfilled. That's something that the government are looking into it. So there are some regulations that are going to come up. Of course, the national planning policy framework is also being updated from December 2024. So all of those changes have a huge impact on whether or not they can actually address the housing issues. But in relation to property investors, there is a huge warning about the fact that if they want to do some new build, there's a huge increase of doing outbuilding, like in rear garden spaces. They are going to try looking into the way of making sure that rear garden space has sufficient space for the new build, but also for the existing properties as well. So there is some ways of trying to encourage property investors, but at the same time, they want to encourage people who are not in the property investment business to make sure they get a fair share of having their own property at the end of the day.
And in terms of the HMO part and driving standards and making sure that standards are risen, clearly that's going to have an impact on business models for HMO investors. But it is really important that we make sure that what we're providing is safe and is of good quality. So we'd really appreciate I'm sure the listeners in particular would really appreciate some practical advice from you about what should property investors look for when they're trying to choose an architect or an architectural technician, and who to work with, essentially.
I would recommend to choose an architect technician, architectural technologist, an architectural designer based on knowledge and experience. Experience in terms of knowing what they do. They have this expertise of knowing the rules and regulations of what you do with HMO or flat conversions. It gives you a safe comfort to make sure they know what they're doing. There have been some architects or designers that don't know how HMO or how flat conversions works in some elements in terms of property investment or property development. And you could also say about knowledge, there are some architects that are quite not well. I think architects nowadays are quite aware about HMO rules and regulations and licensing policies, but when it comes to builder regulations, there's a role where a principal designer comes in terms of making sure that fire safety regulations being adhered. I think there are some property investors that I've come across, a few of them really wants to have a principal designer, which some architects are not fond of because of the type of knowledge you need to know about builder regulations, as well as fire safety regulations, the pre-construction information, and health and safety files. All of that information is required. But I would encourage people who are property investors, first timers, to always go with an architect that has that in-depth, full knowledge, making sure they've got very good feedback from previous tenants that has had that HMO experience. Because if you don't have that experience, I think it just, as we discussed about architects working slowly, if you have that experience and you recognise the issues that come across with HMO or property developing in black conversion, that gives you a safe comfort that the work can be swiftly moved on as quickly as you can. So that's what I would look into in terms of choosing an architect that could actually also communicate. I think communication is one thing that is a bit of an issue, because when it comes to language, an architect could speak a very high level of high level of English that don't know what the property investor know what they're talking about. I've always choose an architect that understands, because not only from an architectural point of view, but also a contractor or builder that make sure they know what they're building. Because if there's a loss of communication, loss in translation, in terms of input, in terms of investment and how much you can spend, making sure all the plans and documents are clear to the property investor as well as the contractor, making sure it goes smoothly without any issues. And I feel like communication and collaboration is something that architects are quite fond of. Some are, some aren't. But when you collaborate with an architect and a contractor, I think something, as long as everyone's singing the same rhythm, then everything's all good at the end of the day.
Yeah, it really helps if the individual who you're selecting has that experience, that knowledge, can prove those projects which they've worked on to carry you through to a successful completion of yours. So are there any red flags that property investors should look for when hiring someone within your profession?
I think the red flags is it's all about experience. If the architect or the architectural designer doesn't have that much experience, then I think that's a red flag, because at the end of the day, it's all about having knowledge and experience and demonstrating the storytelling moment to make sure the do's and don'ts in doing property investment in a building or a project in a particular building. There are some architects or designers don't have good organizational skills. I think that's one thing that's a red flag. I think one thing that's when it comes to sending your fee proposal to a property investor, there are stages where there's an unclear scope of services. Sometimes the person would expect more or someone's expected less. So, sometimes architects don't provide a detailed proposal outlining their responsibilities or deliveries, scope of expectations, or project milestones. I think because there's a lack of clarity about post-design services, for example, site visits or project management or supporting during construction. Some of it is clear, it's not unclear. So, sometimes architects don't say or state what is required in the process. So, yeah, I think it's just making sure they clear those up, but sometimes they don't present what is required. So they might say you have to pay an extra fee to be a principal designer role, which is quite expected because they don't clearly state what is the extra charges in the process. So that's something that some architects have this tendency to do. And I think the biggest red flag is when it comes to resistance to collaboration. There are some architects that can't work in teams. They're not quite fond of working with specific consultants or engineers or interior designers. There is a red flag when an architect doesn't communicate or doesn't share ideas of other people. I think that causes a huge concern about how much money you're putting into making sure the architect gives that advice to the builder or to an electrician when it comes to the layout. So you have to have that, making sure there's clear communication. But sometimes architects don't often communicate or collaborate depending on the type of architect you are in terms of working in teams or not working with specific people or even difficult people. At the end of the day, you're working in a team and you're making sure you get the work completed at the final stages of construction.
Yeah, and the devil is in the detail of that contract or agreement, ultimately. So it takes take the time to read that, understand that, ask the questions up front before you sign anything.
Yeah.
I think is the practical advice you're giving there. Can you explain the architectural process and how property investors can prepare for each each stage of that. Just give a bit of a flavour
Yeah.
to help our listeners get prepared, so when they are working through a project, they'll have a bit of a better understanding.
Yeah. So yeah, there are different specific stages. There's like a minimum of 8 stages in terms of the architectural process. It typically involves several stages from the initial concept to the completed building. I think property investors should look out for the benefits from understanding these stages and preparing for each one to ensure their project is completed on time, within the budget, and meet all expectations. So you're looking at like the first stage is all about pre-design initial consultation. So you talk about what is the proposals, what do you expect on your goals for the project, what you hope to achieve, in terms of target market, return on investment. And also as well, I think I've always encouraged not only property investors but clients in residential development is ensure you have a realistic budget, because many times where people set their budget at their specific limit, at the end of the construction stage, it does go over like 5 to 10%. So you have to be realistically ensure your budget is actually set upon. And then you get to the concept design stages where, I will create some initial sketches, designs, and proposals that will satisfy the property investor, because just to make sure they are actually happy with the layout or they're happy with the proposals. I think it's just making sure with, property investors should actually prepare to be open to these creative ideas, because if they are set to one particular idea, it may not work. So you have to be open to multiple ideas in the process, so you get a clear sense, because sometimes it may not fulfill your budget, depending on how you fulfill your expectations of that particular layout or a particular building for your HMO or for your flat conversion. You want to ensure that they are happy with whether or not it fulfills the budget. I've always encouraged, going back to the first stage, is to build a cost consultant to see, or there's a software that specializes in cost calculation, particular layout, and how much materials is going to be used to ensure that the budget doesn't go over the top. That would also accommodate, particular contractors or subcontractors that specialize in certain fields like plumbing or extracting. So all of that information that's going to be involved in, just to make sure there's key design elements in the process as well. And then the design development stages is making sure the design is being refined for planning and for building regulations. They have to make sure, if the property investor have to make sure that be certain with their final decision when it comes to the ideas, because there's a common theme where property investors tend to change after this stage, which causes a lot of issues in terms of costs and budgeting issues. But we make sure that it's being fully assured with the property investor, so make sure it would not have any impact in terms of aesthetics and costs, and making sure the design aligns with the practical concerns, such as the space or function. So all of that needs to come in line. So that's the third stage when it comes to design development. And then that stage is where, you submit your plans, you get an approval, and then the next stage is construction documentation, where we prepare detailed construction drawings for building control along with specifications, making sure it complies with not only building control, it complies with the building itself. The property investors need to ensure that all decisions regarding materials and finishes are finalised to prevent any delays or changes. As I've mentioned before, it will cause a huge issue if you make this decision late, and that it will have a huge impact on the contractor's schedule, in terms of the timetable itself to complete certain stages within the building itself. But also making sure they review the construction documents for accuracy and making sure there's no errors in the process itself. I think that's something that making sure everything's run smoothly, because again, if there's lots of communication in terms of not specifying the right materials or choosing the wrong materials, and that's being sent to the contractor, is not being built up to that standards, then there's a concern that could lead to some delays. And then you look in terms of the next stage of tendering and contractor selection. So you get all your documents. Tendering is where the contractor puts a bid based on the construction documentation. So, I can actually assist the property investor in terms of choosing the contractor that fulfills not only the budget, but also the feedback, knowing the experience in terms of dealing with flat conversions. I think when it comes to choosing the right contractor, they have to be prepared about evaluating the right contractor. You're looking at choosing a contractor up to 5 contractors available in the market. Always consider about their experience, reputation, and previous work. Also as well, with the architect role in this, is make sure the architect can work with the contractor when it comes to dealing with any queries or issues. At some stages, the client will like to choose his own builder or contractor, but it depends on the experience itself and the budget expectations. But also as well, you need to make sure they've got the right insurances, like professional indemnity insurance or public liability insurance as well. And then the next stage is the construction phase stages, where the building process begins in terms of how the contractor starts in terms of his scheduling program. I've always ensure when it comes to monitoring on site, making sure there's a system for monitoring progresses, such as regular site visits or meetings with the contractor or with the architect. As I mentioned before, you will be prepared for unexpected issues. When it comes to site visiting or site construction visits, things that doesn't run smoothly, so there'll be something unexpected. So for example, working on a big project in Nottingham as a basement conversion, and we've realised there's unexpected large tumbles of rubble that's affected the construction program, which means the excavation program for the ground to be dug deep has to be delayed for another 4 to 8 weeks for it to get away from it. So all of those unexpected issues could have a huge impact. However, I've always encouraged my clients as well as property investors to make sure there's a contingency plan in place, because sometimes if anything doesn't go wrong, a contingency plan is where cost, maybe an extra cost that could be clearly stated to the property investor to make sure there's like any issues addressed on site, or if they can't order a specific material, or they have to order material from abroad and the delivery is going to take some time, there should be some kind of contingency plan for the contractor to make sure it runs sufficiently in terms of making sure that other tasks are being completed on site. So yeah, just keep making sure there's progress reports, change orders, cost tracking to ensure the project stays on budget, which that's the main thing we need to ensure that. And then when it comes to the next stage, the 7th stage, is the post-construction completion. Making sure when the project is completed, you will have your improved inspector will make sure that there's some investigation and reviewing how the construction works. You get your fire certificate, you get your electrical certificate, you get your fire safety certificate. Normally a fire engineer will come and visit, or a fire consultant will come and look at the property to make sure everything's in place. For HMO or flat conversion, making sure there's the fire extinguishers into place, fire exit signs, making sure that there's the fire escapes is sufficient, and also as well when it comes to fire services, making sure the fire services can enter the property as well. All of that will be presented on the documentation to ensure that it complies with Approved Document Part B when it comes to fire safety regulations. But that's something that property investors will actually have to expect, is there's going to be external consultants coming in and review all these changes, such as a fire consultant or even a mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineer that deals with the plumbing, the electrical stuff, mechanical stuff with the extractor fans and such. So all of that comes into a cost as well, making sure they find the right person to do these things. And then finally, when it comes to post-occupancy evaluation, it's like the final stage when everything's all complete and all said and done. Some people do this process where they choose to evaluate the building's performance after it's been occupied for a while. So this phase helps identify any issues or areas of improvement. So for example, when it comes to tenancy satisfaction, making sure there's no door or window issues, or there's no electrical issues or plumbing issues. So I always encourage property investors or anyone who wants to get into the business to get feedback from your tenants or occupants, because sometimes the building's function or its construction, post-construction, does come into a stage when you see damp, there's mold build up, or there's a plumbing issue with hot water issues or electrical issues. There's this rectification period where for 6 to 12 months, there's an opportunity for the works to be addressed by the contractor, making sure that they'll be open to addressing any minor issues that may arise, such as adjustments to spaces or systems at a given time space. You don't want to get that negative feedback from the tenant or occupant living in your property. Also, at the end of the day, making sure they understand and prepare for each stage of the architecture process. Because property investors can make informed decisions that help ensure that their projects are successful from concept to completion. You have to make sure at the end of the day they get a good idea of what they expect, because there have been stories, and I think the biggest story of all is based upon their budget exceeded around 10 to 20% because of those unexpected issues during the construction stages, or they had to alter the plans in terms of you didn't realise it's not built to a realistic expectation at the end. But that's how those 8 stages is all about the concept of completion outcome in terms of what the property investor expects to do. It is long-winded. It's going to cost a lot of money, but if you choose the right individuals, if you choose the right architect, if you choose the right contractor, if you choose the right sub-consultants as well, making sure they understand your language of completing the works, then it will come to success in terms of making sure the works have been completed successfully without any cause or damage to the budget itself.
And that's really detailed, Ken. And certainly it's almost exhausting from a property investor's side, but it's so important to have these things in place and to work with good people. So it's building up your team of good, trusted colleagues who you can work with time and time again, who are going to support you. You can't hold all the knowledge yourself as a property investor. That's probably one of the things I've learned, is certainly over the years, you will obviously become more aware of certain things. You will increase your knowledge as a property investor. However, you can't be an expert in absolutely everything. So you need those experts to support your journey and to support you to be successful. And ultimately, it's about having a team around you, whether those are people who are employed directly or whether they're individuals who you work with on a regular basis. So